Okay, I think we're probably good to go. So good morning again, everyone. It's great to see so many people have joined this morning's call already. The numbers are ticking up slightly, but yeah, brilliant to see. And thank you very much for attending this morning. So by quick way of introductions, I'm Niall Dowds, for anyone who hasn't joined any of these business development webinars before. And I am Broker Propositions Manager, which is all about our focus on Club Blue. And I'm delighted this morning to be co-hosting today's webinar alongside Sue Capper from Zurich Resilience Solutions. And I will pass over to Sue shortly. Just do a quick bit of housekeeping. The title of today's webinar, as I'm sure you're all aware and should be hopefully on the screen in front of you, is about unmasking PFAS. So really exciting topic. We haven't done this one before, so I personally am excited to see what Sue has in store for us this morning. And yeah, should be a good one. In terms of just general housekeeping, just so you know, the call is being recorded and we plan to upload this recording to YouTube after we've finished today. So that'll be available for you guys to watch back or pass on to any colleagues. We'll send the recording round in our follow-up email afterwards, as well as a feedback form. So please do, yeah, please do keep an eye out for that one and let us know how we got on today. In terms of the format for today, we are going to be doing a presentation followed by around about a 15-minute Q&A. So if you've got any questions that you've brought along with you today, or if anything pops into your head while Sue is presenting, please do just put it in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will do our best to address these at the end. Just as a heads up, so Sue is, as you can see, a principal risk consultant at Zurich Resilience Solutions. So Sue doesn't work in claims or underwriting. So any questions like that, Sue probably won't be the best person to get back to you on, but do let us know send us an email afterwards and we will get someone to get back to you if you have any questions on those topics. So that would be absolutely fine. I think that's probably everything from me. So, Sue, if it's all right, I will pass over to you.
Thank you. Fantastic. So thank you very much, Niall. And yeah, good morning, everybody. So as Niall said, my name is Sue Capper and I am Principal Risk Consultant with Zurich Resilience Solutions. And ZRS are actually basically an arm of Zurich. So we provide risk consultancy for our customers and also sort of underwriter assurance. And PFAS is a topic really that's been of interest to me over the last sort of 2.5 years, really, as it sort of suddenly came up as an emerging risk. So it's something I sort of tend to follow and have a lot of interest in. But anyway, let's kind of get started and we'll look at what we're going to cover today. So what I'm going to hopefully cover during this session today is, so what are PFAS? Where do we find PFAS? Why are we bothered about them? So what are the health concerns? We're going to look at areas of liability, how PFAS are regulated and some of the litigation that's already gone on. And then we're going to finish with a little bit of a look at, so what is it that organisations can or should be doing around PFAS? And then, as Niall mentioned, there'll be some time for questions at the end. So let's get started. So PFAS basically stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, also often referred to as the forever chemicals. And PFAS are basically a group of man-made chemicals that were first accidentally made back in the 1940s by DuPont. And probably the more common ones include things like PFOA, PFOS, and the brand names of Gen-X or C6. And they're called the forever chemicals because they are very stable and persistent in the environment. And thoughts are that it could take hundreds or even thousands of years for them to break down naturally. Different countries and states and even agencies have different definitions of PFAS. And depending on the one used, depends on actually how many PFAS fall within the class. But reports suggest that there could be anywhere between 12 and 15,000 different PFAS substances. And the definition that you can see on the bottom right of the screen is the one that's used by the ECHA in Europe and also by the OECD, and therefore is probably the most widely known. So this slide shows the PFAS cycle, and it actually describes how PFAS that are or have been used in manufacture, in firefighting, in waste and put into landfill can be released into the environment through the various waste streams and end up getting into the air, the water, the soil, and lead to human and wildlife exposure. The carbon-fluorine bond that we saw on the previous slide is incredibly strong and doesn't degrade naturally, and also resists deliberate attempts to break it down. But interestingly, it's these same properties that also make it the wonder product that's resulted in its use in so many different applications. So, where is it that PFAS are actually found? So, this map shows where PFAS have been found. So the red dots show the areas of known contamination. The blue is presumed in industrial areas. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of blank areas, but that doesn't mean there is no PFAS. It's just that it hasn't been tested for or known at the time that this map was put together. And PFAS is a global issue. It's been found in the rain in Tibet, in the Antarctica, and in meltwater from Mount Everest. And in the UK, it's been suggested that there could be as many as 21,000 old landfill sites releasing PFAS. And in 2019, the UKEA embarked on a study of PFAS that resulted in a report into the sources, pathways, and environmental data on PFAS. And this was published in 2021. And the key areas that they noted as having the highest potential as sources of PFAS were legacy sources of land contamination that included civilian airfields, military airfields and bases, firefighting training sites, fire stations, wastewater treatment works, and of course the landfill sites that I mentioned on the previous slide. And then manufacturing industries that were noted as high risk sources included those in textiles, leather, carpets, paper, cardboard, chemical and chrome plating. They also undertook a large water sampling programme that tested for the presence of PFOS and PFOA in rivers, groundwater, estuaries and coastal water, and found the widespread presence of them, and so concluded that PFAS are widely present in environmental waters. They also interestingly stated that due to PFAS's persistent nature, that even if sources of PFAS stopped, concentrations would decline very slowly due to the fact that they are very hard to remediate. So if we look in a little bit more detail at where you can find PFAS, it's probably easier to say, where do you not find them, as they are pretty well in everything. So they're used because of their oil and water resistant properties, and they can also provide a stable film on surfaces. And if you've ever used an umbrella or put on a waterproof coat and noticed that little water forms little beads on the surface, it's likely that that waterproofing has in fact come from PFAS. And its ability to withstand high temperatures, be stable in chemical environments, reduce surface tensions, provide lubrication, and also provide UV resistant, make it attractive for use in a huge range of products. And as you can see from the pictures, this includes being used in things like cosmetics, shampoos, sunscreen, your non-stick cookware, and firefighting foams. It's also used in some food packaging, in car seats, cleaning products, and clothing. And of course, every time clothes are washed, or if you use your cleaning products and shampoos, PFAS enters the drain and ends up getting into sewers and starts that whole PFAS cycle that we mentioned earlier. So why are we so concerned about PFAS? So what are the health concerns? So there is evidence that PFAS exposure can cause a number of different adverse health effects. And this can come about by eating or drinking PFAS containing substances, breathing in fumes, aerosols and dust that contain PFAS, or it being absorbed through the skin. And there is no known safe exposure level, but research in the US by the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease has suggested that there could be potential adverse effects between 2 and 20 nanograms per milliliter of PFAS in your blood, and that there are expected adverse health effects at over 20 nanograms of PFAS in the blood. So some of the potential key health effects from PFAS substances are things like increased cholesterol levels, changes in liver enzyme and metabolism, interference with the body's hormones, reproductive issues, and lower birth weights. And children have been found to have reduced responses to vaccines and a general low immunity for everybody. There is also a link with raised blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, preeclampsia, and pregnancy. And it's also been identified that there are increased risk of breast, kidney, thyroid, and other cancers. And there have also been suggestions of developmental delays and obesity in children. And of course, people can be exposed from many different sources over time, and this then builds up to a point where it has these adverse health effects. So what about areas of liability and sort of potential exposures? So if we start with thinking about employers' liability, so any companies that are manufacturing PFAS products or buying in and using PFAS as part of their production process could mean that employees are potentially exposed during any of the manufacturing, handling, maintenance, or cleaning processes. And if we consider something like a carpet manufacturer, either the synthetic materials or dyes used could contain PFAS. And if any form of stain or water resistance is being applied, then it could also be PFAS. And I heard an example where dust that was sitting on the ledges in a carpet factory was tested and found to contain PFAS. Hence, for it to get there meant that it had been airborne, and so employees would have been breathing this in. And then if we also consider the people in the shops that cut the carpets and the fitters who install them, there will be fibres and dust shedding that could be breathed in, and also skin contact. Then, of course, we've got the public liability. If there was to be an escape or leak of PFAS or PFAS substances, this could cause harm or contamination to a neighbour, to individuals, their property, or the environment. And an example of this was in the Netherlands, where 750,000 people were exposed to high levels of PFAS from the Chemours factory and were told not to eat any locally produced fruit, vegetables, or eggs, as they've been found to contain very high levels of PFAS. And in the UK, Bentham, a town in Yorkshire, is said to be the most PFAS polluted in the country due to a company manufacturing foam fire extinguishers that contained PFAS, with concerns being expressed around health and property prices in the vicinity. Then thirdly, we have product liability. So if we go back to our carpet example, the end user could also be exposed. So dusts and fibres will shed from the carpet during its lifetime of use and be breathed in. And young children could be playing or crawling around on it, have skin contact with it, and also put their fingers in their mouths, so likely to ingest it as well as breathing it in. And then textiles and clothing that are worn next to the skin could also result in PFAS absorption. And one of the class actions in the US at the moment is around firefighters wearing PPE containing PFAS, resulting, it's claimed, in skin contamination. And a study in the US in 2022 found that stain-resistant school uniforms had high levels of PFAS that could expose children to PFAS through skin contact, inhalation of fibres, or ingestion after touching their uniforms. The good news is that in the UK, many retailers have committed to providing PFAS-free options. And then, of course, there is the firefighting foams previously mentioned, and the use of these has led to a lot of ground and water pollution globally. So PFAS, how are they regulated? Well, PFAS are regulated differently depending on the country. And even within the US, it varies depending on which state you're actually in. So if we look at start with a bit of an overview, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants is a global treaty put in place to protect human health and the environment from persistent chemicals that cause serious health effects. And the requirement was for this to then be incorporated into local domestic laws and policies. And the examples there on the screen show the EU and UK's compliance with this. And in the US, regulations, as I've said, vary state by state. But the PFAS Action Act of 2021 was a bill aimed at regulating PFAS at federal level, but was never enacted at Senate. However, the EPA has continued to regulate PFAS in the US, and this includes limits on PFAS in drinking water, effluent limitations, and a polluter pays regime. So in Europe, there are a number of existing and proposed regulations in the EU. And because there are so many, I'm really just going to give a very top level overview of these. But under REACH, a number of PFAS substances are restricted across Europe, with further substances being added from 2026. And there's also a proposal to ban all PFAS in firefighting foams. The EU is considering a universal PFAS restriction covering a wide range of PFAS and would apply to all PFAS substances containing the CF2 or CF3 molecule, because it's argued that due to the huge numbers of PFAS substances, targeting individual substance is neither effective or practical. And from February this year, the new packaging and packaging waste regulations place strict requirements on PFAS levels in food packaging, although there are already regulations around PFAS in packaging and food under the food contacts material regulations and also the food contaminants regulations. There is also a drinking water directive that specifies maximum limits of PFAS in drinking water, and this requires all member states to have taken action by January 2026, although a number of members such as Denmark, Sweden and Germany have already put strict measures in place. The EU is also finalising a proposal to introduce requirements for soil monitoring, which once law would need to be implemented within 3 years. And in April 2025, the EU agreed new toy safety regulations to replace the existing toy safety directive. And among other things, it bans the intentional inclusion of PFAS in toys. Then there is the wastewater directive. So that came into force last January to address the presence of pollutants in wastewater and will require the monitoring of PFAS at wastewater treatment plants and will apply the polluter pays principle to industries that contribute to pollution levels. And then in February this year, France went out on a bit of a limb and passed new legislation to prohibit the manufacture, import and sale of products containing PFAS in cosmetics, clothing, textiles, apart from PPE, and also ski waxes. And that is due to come into force in January 2026. And then they have the intention to extend this to all textiles by 2030. So in contrast, the UK PFAS regulations are a lot more limited. However, for those businesses that trade with the EU and globally, there are, as we've seen, a range of regulations that businesses need to be aware of. And of course, Northern Ireland is still subject to many EU regulations, and this includes PFAS. And under the persistent organic pollutions regulations, certain named PFAS and their salts and related compounds are subject to exemptions around manufacture and sale of products containing them. There are no specific regulations around levels of PFAS in drinking water in the UK. However, under the Water Supply Water Quality Regulations of 2016, water is required to be wholesome and must not contain any substance at a level which would create danger to human health. And the DWI has provided guidance on this and requires water and companies to comply a cumulative limit of 100 nanograms per litre for 48 different PFAS substances. And interestingly, a recent article stated that the DWI have actually issued around 23 enforcement notices to water companies for elevated PFAS levels. And the DWI recommended levels basically equate to 0.1 part per million. And if we compare that with the US, who in some states have regulations that require less than 4 parts per trillion, so we're comparing parts per million with parts per trillion, this actually shows the wide difference in standards. And then post-Brexit, the UK operates its own version of REACH, which is overseen by the Health and Safety Executive. And it requires that any manufacturers or importers to understand the hazards of substances that they're supplying to the GB market and to ensure that they can be used safely. And in 2023, the HSE published an RMOA, which is a regulatory management option analysis, which is not legally binding, but was an assessment of the likely health and environmental risks for consideration. However, due to the definitions of PFAS adopted by the Health and Safety Executive, this reduced the number of PFAS substances in scope from the thousands we saw earlier down to just a few hundred. It did, however, contain some recommendations around limiting the use of the in-scope PFAS in foams, textiles, furniture, and cleaning products. And from the 4th of July this year, following a transition period, the use of firefighting foams that contained PFOA was prohibited. And in August, the HSE opened a 6-month consultation on restricting the use of all PFAS in firefighting foams, not just the PFOA. So this shows how varied the regulatory landscapes are, but that there are increasing trends towards PFAS regulation. And as more research and information comes forward, and based on economic, political, and consumer views, this is likely to be subject to further and ongoing change that companies really do need to keep abreast of, and particularly around the whole product safety law. So, having looked at the regulations, let's have a little look at what litigation has already taken place around the world. So some of the PFAS claims started in the US with some high-profile cases. And if anyone has ever seen the film Dark Waters, this is based on a true case. So in the 1980s, a cattle rancher reported the deaths of hundreds of his cows. His ranch and creek bordered the DuPont plant, who had been discharging PFAS into the river. And DuPont was successfully sued by him. This then led to further lawsuits involving the local townspeople, where there was a probable link found between 6 diseases and the PFOA that had been discharged from the plant. And DuPont settled 3,500 personal injury claims totaling $671 million. And the EPA also fined a further $16.5 million for failure to disclose the health risks in their plant and for the water remediation costs. Then in 2010, a lawsuit was brought against 3M by the state of Minnesota for PFAS chemicals damaging drinking water and natural resources in some 100 miles of the Mississippi River. They sought $5 billion for cleanup costs, but on the eve of the trial ended up settling out of court for $850 million. Then in 2023, 3M agreed to pay a further $10.3 billion over the next 13 years to detect and treat contaminated water supplies in the US. And there is currently a firefighting foam lawsuit based on occupational PFAS exposures to firefighters and military personnel who have been shown to have high PFAS levels in their blood. And this is in process of going to court. The trial date was set for October 25, but this has recently been pushed back. But to date, more than 12,915 claims have been consolidated into a multi-district litigation. and lawsuits have been filed against 25 different companies. So that will be a really interesting one to see how that all sort of pans out. And then just to show it's not just the US, there are some examples here of some international claims. So in Australia, there are 3 examples here where property and landowners have successfully sued the Department of Defence and the federal government over foam usage that caused PFAS contamination and then subsequent loss of property values. And actually, as you can see on the slide there, resulted in some quite large payouts. Then a little bit closer to home, in Europe here, we can see that in 2002, 3M were manufacturing PFAS in Flanders, and it leaked over a period of years. And in 2018, it was found in nearby soil and in the bloodstreams of local residents at very high levels. The Belgian government ended up reaching a settlement with 3M for 571 million euros. And then in Sweden, a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court confirmed that high levels of PFAS in the blood constitutes legal personal injury. And this was in response to a lawsuit in the town near a military base that had contaminated water. And this very much sets a precedent and the potential for more PFAS lawsuits. And then in Italy, the Miteni plant produced PFAS from the 1960s until it went bankrupt in 2018. And during that time, it discharged contaminated wastewater into local water systems that led to widespread contamination of ground, surface, and drinking water. It affected 100 square kilometres and 350,000 residents. It was finally detected in 2013, and earlier this year, the court sentenced 11 former executives to a total of 141 years in prison. And it also awarded around 20,000 euros to each of the citizens that have been affected. In addition, there was a historic ruling by the Court of Vicenza that recognised a causal link between the death of a Miteni plant employee in 2014 and with prolonged exposure to PFAS. So, as we saw on the earlier slides, the UK has fallen behind on its regulatory approach. However, in 2005, there was a massive explosion at Buncefield Oil Storage Depot. And at the height of the fire service were using somewhere in the region of 32,000 litres per minute of PFAS foam that resulted in massive runoff. And in 2006, Three Valleys Water detected PFOS in boreholes close to the site. And that led to Hertfordshire Oil Storage being prosecuted for causing pollution. And they were fined 1.45 million and a further 1 million in costs. There is an ongoing civil claim at the moment for a retired firefighter diagnosed with cancer who is claiming he was exposed to PFOA in the foam that he used during his career. And again, the outcome of this one will certainly be one for us to keep an eye on. There is currently an ongoing investigation around alleged contamination of allotments in Lancashire by PFOA from AGC Chemicals. And one that has made the news quite recently is Angus Fire in Yorkshire, who manufactured foam fire extinguishers containing PFAS and currently being investigated for potential claims due to PFAS contamination of the local area. And the EA are also looking into this. And as I also mentioned earlier, the DWI are actively issuing enforcement notices to water companies for elevated PFAS levels in drinking water. So, what can or should organisations be doing around PFAS? Well, the first thing really is to establish if you have any PFAS exposure, either now or in the past, and if so, to what extent. So the type of industry or the trade sector is an important consideration. And as mentioned earlier, those with the greatest potential of risk are things those that manufacture things like textiles, carpets, leather, chemicals, water treatment, landfill, firefighting foam manufacturers and trainers, paper, cardboard, and also the chrome plating sectors. And another important factor to consider is the type of land or site that the organisation is on, or what it might have been used for previously, or what their neighbours might or did do. And in New Mexico, a farmer who was in the vicinity of a military base found that his land and water had been contaminated with PFAS. And that led to his crops, his cattle, his milk having very high levels of PFAS. So he was unable to sell any of his products and ended up having to destroy his dairy herd. Then closer to home, the Duxford Aquifer in Cambridge became contaminated from an old disused airfield base that led to 1,200 residents having their water supply contaminated with PFAS. So a key consideration is obviously, what does the business actually do? And do any of the processes involve them actually using any PFAS, or do ingredients, raw materials, or components that they use contain PFAS? And water should be considered as an ingredient where it's being incorporated at high percentages in food or beverages. And a recent study of beers sampled in the US found that 22 out of 23 that were tested contained PFAS at levels higher than the water drinking limits. The type of fire extinguishing media being used should also be a consideration. And those sectors that are most likely to have foam sprinkler systems are those that manufacture or store such things as chemicals, paints, fuels, and plastics. And from July this year, as I previously mentioned, foams containing PFOA were prohibited from being used. However, there is a potential that some businesses could still be out there not aware of that, and so it is one worth checking. Then, of course, it's about thinking about the end product and the likely exposure routes to customers and the public. And in order to identify if PFAS is present, a good starting point is the safety data sheet. But a word of caution here, as they are not always accurate. And a recent survey showed that around about 30% contained the wrong information and also may not even list PFAS, even though it might be present. So would therefore suggest asking the supplier the direct question about PFAS. And if that fails, then you could consider testing for it. And testing has become increasingly more sophisticated and can detect down to some pretty incredibly low levels. So a risk assessment should be carried out for PFAS using the usual approach of looking at who could be harmed, and this should include employees, the public, the products and the environment, and also the various routes of exposure and, of course, the level of risk. It's then about putting in controls in line with the hierarchy control. Hence, the first step to consider is, could PFAS be eliminated or substituted for something less hazardous? And my next two slides give examples of where this has actually been successfully done. So this shows how PFAS foam has been replaced by a completely fluorine-free F3 foam in major airports and also at a chemical factory in Melbourne. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there is a list of all the airports that have currently switched. And there's a quote in the centre of the slide there that was from the Heathrow Fire Service Compliance Manager and has got some really positive comments around the switch that they made. And interestingly, that the Environment Agency, following tests, allowed the runoff from the new foam solution to actually go direct into the surface water drainage system. And packaging such as pizza boxes, burger boxes, takeaway boxes and packets that your fries go into may get their stain resistance and insulating properties from PFAS. The issue is that if this is next to your food and drink, because PFAS is so mobile, it can easily migrate into your food and drink. And a simple way to identify if packaging contains PFAS is to place a few small drops of vegetable oil onto it. And if it forms the small, neat drops on the surface, like you can see in the picture there, it probably contains PFAS. But if it spreads out or sinks in, it probably doesn't. But the good news is there are PFAS-free alternatives for food packaging. There are things like vegetable parchment, straw, elephant grass, bamboo, palm leaf, and bio-wax coatings. And these have all been successfully used and implemented by a number of food companies. However, just a word of caution, when looking for or making substitutions, please make sure that you do your research, your trials and your assessments first, so that you don't end up with what is known as a regrettable substitution. And this is when one substance is swapped for another that then later turns out to be just as hazardous or even more hazardous than the one you've replaced. And there are currently a lot of businesses doing research and looking for alternatives. However, there are some areas that are struggling, such as those in the semiconductors, acoustic membranes, and inhalers that use PFAS as their propellant. So if we've looked at all this and we can't eliminate or substitute, then the next step is to look to reduce levels to as low as reasonably practicable and to keep this under regular review. So our hierarchy of control basically requires that engineering controls are the next on our list. So essentially, this is about isolating or separating people from the hazard, and that's normally via some kind of a physical means, such as enclosing the process, local extraction ventilation, and automating cleaning processes. And then for environmental protection, this is about minimising the amount of stock that is held and ensuring that it's stored in suitably bundled and contained facilities, and that any emissions are monitored and safe. And of course, any wastewater and residues should be treated through effluent plants and filtered before being discharged, with any remaining contaminated waste being disposed of as hazardous substances through a regulated and licensed company. And for products, there is a need to protect your customers and the end consumer as much as possible. And if PFAS can't be eliminated, then again, look to reduce the PFAS content as low as possible. And look to see if it's possible to seal or protect the product from degradation, and therefore by limiting the migration or seepage of PFAS into the products. So when you've done all that you can do in terms of engineering controls, then the next level in the hierarchy is to look at administrative controls, which basically requires safe ways of working. So some examples of things in this category are having things like alarms or flashing lights or signals when a guard is opened, or warn of rising levels or breaches in set levels. And things like signage and labels can be used to provide warnings or mandatory actions that are required. And of course, clear, safe systems of work that have been generated from risk assessments and trained out are key, as is things like staff rotation and health surveillance. Then the lowest in our hierarchy of control is personal protective equipment. This is last and is used once all other controls have been considered and implemented, and is there to pick up any residual risk. It's considered to be the least effective as it only protects the individual. That is, it creates a safe person rather than a safe workplace. And it's also important that any PPE that is required is actually being used and worn correctly, and that it's being kept in a clean and serviceable condition. And the issue with both administrative controls and PPE is that they rely on the right behaviours of individuals in order to be effective, and so also require a level of supervision and follow-up if they're not being adhered to. So just to conclude then, really, so there is still a lot to learn about PFAS, and as new research and findings unfold, I'm sure there will be ongoing changes to standards and regulations, albeit as we've seen, different countries will probably continue to move at different rates. But where organisations are trading with different countries, it is important to keep abreast of the changes that are going on. And in the meantime, carrying out a PFAS survey and a risk assessment to understand if you have any exposure to PFAS and how well it's been controlled is a really good starting point. Thank you. That's me. So I'll open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was really interesting. And as Sue has said, please do post any questions in the chat. So we have one here from James or Richard, perhaps. It appears we've been exposed to this threat for a long time. Would it not be quite difficult to find proof for an ELPL claim other than major incidents that were publicised at the time? I get the regulation going forward, but the exposure that we have experienced over the last 60 plus years is a little different compared to something like asbestos. All for precaution going forward, but it does feel the horse has bolted, so it appears to be a health and safety element going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that I think people have sort of previously sort of mentioned. So, as you said, I'm not a claims person. I don't work in claims. But I think interestingly, if you recall the slides that I put up earlier, the fact that things like Sweden are now sort of suggesting that having blood in your blood is taken as personal injury, the fact that in Italy they have proven those causal links between PFAS exposure is starting to suggest that even though there is widespread use, there are some of those causal links there. But you're also absolutely right, because PFAS is in so many different places, trying to actually pin it down to that is what of course is going to be a challenge. But as I said again, as we saw in Italy, it was quite clear that that individual had worked in that factory for a number of years. He developed a cancer that was quite clearly linked to that exposure and had been proved over time. So therefore, that's why the court ruled as they did. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is such widespread. And I think part of it is also from a moral perspective, it's that whole thing of we know about it. Are we kind of willing to allow PFAS to keep polluting and doing what it's doing? Because if we don't do something about it, it's only going to get worse. And again, as I mentioned, it could take hundreds or even thousands of years, even if we stopped now to clean it up. So I hope that sort of semi-answered the question.
Thanks, Sue. We got something in from Dawn. Yes, we will be sending around a recording of the webinar after the session, so you'll be in the recipient list for that. We've got a question from Matt asking, are there any filters or friendly chemicals that can reduce the PFAS levels in water liquids?
Okay, so yeah, really, really, really good question. So remediation is one that obviously there's an awful lot of work people looking at the moment. And interestingly, the EA actually recently, just back in September, produced a document that they've been looking at remediation levels. And yes, there are things you can do in liquids. So the types of things you can do are using things like activated carbon. You can use things like ion exchange resins. You can use reverse osmosis, and all those things are things that will take PFAS from liquids and from water. And then where you've got things like soil contamination, then there is a way of sort of washing soil, because PFAS is very mobile. So it is an easy one to wash soil. And then obviously you've then got to remove it from the water via the carbons, filtrations, and so on that I've already mentioned. But the one the EA was sort of calling out as a way of sort of remediation was very much around so thermal treatment. So they're actually basically saying that high temperature incineration of probably, they were specifying it would need to be about 1100 degrees centigrade or more would be the way to actually deal with it. But obviously incineration has got costs and things attached to that. So it would be a high cost to do it. But the EA currently think that is probably the most commercially viable way of getting rid of PFAS, basically.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. We've got a question from Peter asking, is it likely that PFAS exclusions will become a standard liability exclusion, as we see with US markets?
So again, I probably wouldn't answer that one. That would be more for our underwriting colleagues to probably answer that one. But I mean, I do know from talking to brokers that, that they are seeing more and more of that sort of coming into exclusion clauses, yes. But probably, like I say, underwriting might be a better place to answer that one than me.
Sure. And Sarah was going to piggyback off that question, but I would guess probably the same response, Sarah. So please do send it through in the follow-up email if you respond to us, and we can get someone to reply to you. Got a question from Haley. Is there likely to be a date, as there is for null claims, that claims can't be made given the lack of knowledge and understanding and consequences of PFAS contamination?
Oh, really good question. Again, that's probably more one for my claims colleagues on that. But normally, because a lot of the PFAS thing is coming down to a disease-related thing, and normally with disease, we have this whole 40-year thing from the point of first knowledge. So again, I'm guessing it would probably be related to that. But again, that might be one worth putting back to our claims colleagues, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. We can add that to the list. Hopefully this is one for you, Sue, but let us know if not. John has asked, as an officer at local authority within waste services and dealing with operational restrictions around POP's legislation, are we likely to face further waste collection restrictions and legislation changes both for waste collection and disposal operations?
Again, anything is possible. I mean, I think possibly within the UK in the current economic climate, the reason perhaps, I think the UK has been a little bit slower because and again, this is just my personal opinion, because it would be such a big economic thing to put so many restrictions on things. So at the moment, I think the UK is watching to see what the rest of Europe does, what the rest of it's going on. But who knows? Any of this could come forward. The RMOA, I mentioned that the HSC had done, they had mentioned a number of restrictions they were doing. They had pulled it right down to only a few hundred substances being within scope, as opposed to the thousands that Europe are putting within scope. So again, that will reduce things down a little bit. But there is so much ongoing research, and there's hardly a week goes by when there isn't some sort of new article or something that's coming out on PFAS. So, it is very much the emerging and fast moving topic. So anything is possible, I'm afraid. So yeah, best I can answer that one.
Thank you, Sue, again. For this next one, please, yeah, just let us know if again this should be redirected. But Nicola is asking, would local authorities be at risk of these claims, even though they're not part of the company producing chemicals? Not thinking of landfills at this point.
Yeah, again, it depends. I mean, and that's why it's really important to actually think about your exposure. So what exposure have you gone through? I mean, if you were actually had some sort of a site that you took over from somebody else, I actually saw a really interesting article that was published by one of the solicitors, and they were actually saying that if you moved into a site that had previously had something to do with PFAS, and then you were actually doing some sort of a manufacturing or other process on that site, it would make good sense to actually test to see if there are any PFAS contamination, because if at the point you move in, you can prove that PFAS contamination is already there and not caused by you, that gives you the ability to potentially subrogate back to the previous owners. Whereas if you then started to carry out some sort of a recycling operation, landfill or whatever it is on a site that you didn't know, on down the line, somebody then could say all that PFAS contamination was down to you. So that was just one of the recommendations I had read that was coming from one of the external solicitors.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. Any more questions that people might have? If not, I think there's a poll question that might be a good time to put in the chat, Sarah.
Yeah, Niall, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A function.
Okay, let me have a look. I haven't been notified. Oh yes, I have. Okay, so we've got what challenges are associated with PFAS remediation?
So, I mean, I think the challenges with PFAS remediation are that people are still doing an awful lot of research into the best ways to actually remediate. And because, as I mentioned, it is such a tight bond, trying to break that down and do something about it is very costly and very difficult. You know, there is remediation out there. There are companies doing it, and you know there are ways to do it. But you know, the biggest thing is probably the biggest challenge is probably going to be around cost, to be honest with you, because you know it is going to be a very costly thing to do. So I would say that is probably the biggest challenge associated with it.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a point from Peter here saying, having watched Dark Waters some 6 years ago, I've been waiting for insurers to react and it seemed a slow response in the UK. Yeah, I definitely want to be checking that film out. Wasn't even aware of it. That sounds like a good one.
It is a really interesting one. Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure. Go back to the Q&A, see if there's anything there. If anyone has any other points or questions.
Shall I launch the poll question? Let's do that.
That'd be great. Thank you, Sarah. Looks like it's staying around that sort of 70% yes, 30% no, doesn't it? Which is interesting. Well, at least now everyone's on board and aware. Thank you for that, Sarah. Any more questions before we finally wrap up? No worries if you can think of something afterwards and you weren't able to ask this morning, but we can, like I said, we can get back to you. If not later today, early next week, we can find somebody to do that. So I think we're probably good to wrap up. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Really interesting topic. I'm sure you all agree, and certainly picked up a lot. And thank you very much, Sue, for walking that through with us. That was, yeah, really, really interesting. So without further ado, I think we're probably good to close it there. So I hope everyone has a nice rest of your day and rest of your week, and enjoy the weekend when it arrives.
Thank you.
Thank you
Goodbye,
very much.
everybody. Thank you.